I'm Sandra Hebron, and I had the absolute pleasure of curating the Frederick Wiseman retrospective here at the BFI. I think you've had a programme note that gives a little bit of information about our two conversationalists this evening. But just to refresh or remind, if you didn't see that, let me introduce them. So to my extreme right, only physically, definitely not in any other way.
In no other way.
Is Andrea Luka Zimmerman. Andrea is a German-winning artist and filmmaker. Their multi-layered practice has been described as intuitive cinema and often explores responses to structural injustices. Their films include Tashkafar, Stories of the Street, A State, A Reverie, Erase and Forget, Here for Life, and most recently, Wayfaring Stranger. Their practice also includes gallery exhibitions too, with work shown in venues including Arnolfini, Pier and the Whitechapel, and their selected writings include extended essays in Brick, Strangers Within, Documentary as Encounter, and Open Democracy. And then Matthew Barrington is a London-based curator and researcher with a PhD on the subject of slow cinema from Birkbeck, University of London. He runs the Birkbeck Institute for the Moving Image and is a cinema curator at the Barbican Centre. And his areas of curatorial interest include essay films, global modernist cinema, contemporary artists' film, and Afrofuturism, amongst others. Thank you both so much for being here. Just to say a little about how we think this evening might run. First of all, if you're thinking about where you have to be next, we'll have around half an hour together. I think I've heard or read an interview with Frederick Wiseman where he said that one of his hopes or one of his intentions for his films is that they should be a start of conversation. And so it's very much in that spirit that we are here this evening. So we'll talk a little amongst ourselves, but we would really like to then invite you to be part of the conversation too. And I think it's really important to say at the beginning that we are not here because we think we are experts on Frederick Wiseman. We're not Wiseman scholars. We certainly can't speak on his behalf. We're, I think, all three of us, people who have felt some connection with his work. And so that's really the perspective that we are speaking from. And I imagine that some of you in the room might also feel like that. So we would absolutely like to hear your contributions. But to get things started, Andrea, I wonder if I can come to you, because when we were first thinking about this event, although your own films are very different from Fred's films, I wondered about an element of kinship, if you like. And I was really encouraged when I asked you to perhaps be part of this, that you came back to me very quickly and said yes. And that Titicut Follies in particular had been quite a formative film for you. So I wonder if you could kind of continue that sort of line of thought.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this. If I speak too quiet, just say I'm a quiet speaker, I guess. But Titicut Follies, I think I saw it when I started filmmaking. And it was formative for me because, not just because I had been banned, and I watched it on a VHS tape. We had a long conversation around this film and why was it banned and how was it made. And I think for me, over the years, I watched that film so many times, also in order to learn from John Marshall how to frame, how to do an ethics of filmmaking, and how to work within kind of structural violence, and how to work with people and how to give dignity to people. And I feel like that film has a very, for me as a filmmaker, it was formative in the way in which I think when there's when you have so much access and when you have so much power as a filmmaker, like filmmaking it has power because you can cut people up, you can completely change a narrative, right? And the way in which in that scene where they're in a room together, him and another man, John Marshall and another man, and something happens and John Marshall moves away and gives dignity to that person. And I feel for me this is a really, really important learning. It's like, how do we, because often in fiction or in some documentary makers, some emotional scene happens and people go right in. And it's almost like a very extractive way of working. And I feel like his whole, including this film and all the other films now, this was the one I hadn't seen, have versions of that, like a dignity and a respect to the people who are in the film.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea. And Matthew, do you remember when you first encountered Fred's work and what resonated with you?
Yeah, it's interesting because in many ways it's kind of opposite of what Andrea was saying, because for me, you know, he was like a myth in a way, because the films weren't on DVD, the films weren't shown on television, and you know, even though I studied film at university, it wasn't part of the canon, right? But you'd hear of this mystical figure making 4-hour films in libraries, you know, and then like, it's always interesting when that you find the practice that you really connect to, that you've been through the kind of institutions, right, and these spaces and not found this work. So when I did finally, you know, encounter this work, what really struck me was like his presence and his ability with his team, cinematographers, to kind of be present in the moment and have this openness so that his own, you know, ideas or hypothesis isn't necessarily what's guiding the film. And that results in us also being present in there as well. So we're kind of part of this process of discovering things, and that openness. And it's a technical thing, but it's not a small thing, but it's a gesture. And I think that's something which resonates throughout these films, really, in a really beautiful way. And I think it's one of his key contributions to this field.
And of course, he's often talked about in quite a reductive way as the person who makes films about institutions, which first of all sounds actually rather dry and quite boring. But I always feel like the films are really about people. They're about the people who make up those institutions and the relationships between those people. And even although I didn't rewatch High School tonight, I've watched it recently, I just think about how he uses close-ups and how close we are to people. But also, Andrea, as you say, then sometimes, you know, we are kind of deliberately sort of taken further away. Do you feel that this emphasis, if you like, on the people and their relationships is one of the things that makes the work so compelling?
I mean, yeah, for me, what is really compelling about his work is that it humanizes institutions, right? And for example, like the Maisel brothers, who make Salesmen, which I really love. But if you think about institutions and how we think about structures, capitalist structures, or safeguarding against certain structures. I mean, it flipped also in his career, right? Like from being very critical to institutions to being actually quite defending of them. And I feel that, so whereas other filmmakers would go through for the struggle of one person or like a group of people, but individuals within a system, he's kind of, he's humanizing a system. And I think this is really interesting because it's almost, I don't want to call it democratic because it's not democratic, right? But like it gives like it says we are made up of all these different parts, like these institutions. They're not, you know, so we also have an agency within it. And I feel like we can be participating within, because you see these kind of ideas and like this passion, and also some of the people's like real concerns with making life better for others and for each other, right? Like, so that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, again, like, there's a weird humor as well, because even this like high school, welfare, hospital, it's like, it sounds so macro and so grandiose. And obviously, you know, when we're watching the films, we're often watching these like small gestures, and it's how he's able to kind of, you know, give space to these small things as well. And so that kind of like dry humor runs throughout his films. But also, like, as you're saying, like, it's so fascinating because these people and these kind of intimate moments, though, right, that shape the films. And it's incredible to think about this film because it's like 75 minutes, right, which is very, very short in terms of his oeuvre. But with the longer films, you have sometimes like 14-minute sex sequences, right, which is like half an episode of EastEnders, right? It's like 14 minutes. It's a huge amount of time. And just to follow and allow this thing, so it breaks up the kind of centrality or the kind of completeness of the institution by giving rise to these kind of like moments of surprise and spontaneity. And these are the things which I think stay with me much more than an analysis of, you know, X institution. But it's really fascinating to see these kind of things playing out, the macro and the micro across all these different films.
Because isn't he also asking, like, what is this life that we are living? You know, and like Titicut Follies, who is in charge of determining that you're inside or outside, right? For example, or who is trying to, what is education? What actually is it?
Which somewhat brings me on, I think, to the next point that I wanted to really bring into the conversation. There's a quote from Fred that I've used in one of the notes for the season where he says, "You can make the argument that indirectly all my films are political." Now, I know that that's one of the reasons why I am drawn to his work, but I'd be really interested to hear how far each of you see the films as political, and you know, what particularly you think that he's, albeit in a very kind of open way, asking us to consider.
I mean, you used a phrase just now, like the inside and outside. And for me, what I find really fascinating is that, from my perspective as someone who works a lot, you know, with films that are dealing with race, like no one would ever say that Frederick Wiseman is a black filmmaker or necessarily like you know, it's not someone you think of with the canon of important black films, but crosses over it though, right? Like you see, like, you know, American race relations like sleeping in, right? And even in this film, the two external events which fall into the space of the school is Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement, right? And then you hear, I think it's one mention of exactly that, right? And again, this happens throughout his films over the 50 years, right? Even in the present day. And those things are so fascinating, and how these things seep in, you know, and how, again, the rhythm and the way in which he's opening the space means that these moments in my, you know, for me, which are inflamed, my lived experience, right? These race relations are so present across these films. And then again, we're aware of what's happening in the 60s and 70s. And so these things become such fascinating documents of their time, really. And so the other quote I like that he makes is he's talking about his politics, and he says he's more Groucho Marx than Karl Marx, right? You know, which is quite funny because, you know, this idea of him as a serious kind of curmudgeon is ridiculous. He's a funny guy, right? But I think that's also, again, kind of underlying just what's happening in the films as well, and having a certain kind of like delicacy, you know. So for me, it's really fascinating. It touched so many different political issues, but without hammering you over the head with it.
I suppose for me, what is really important always is I'm not very drawn to films that are proselytizing or moral, that they have a moral high ground, because I think that's when the danger happens, that the blind spots happen. And I think he's asking these questions, and he's also saying that institutions are only functioning if actual events are seeping in, are allowed to seep in, and there's a porousness and an ambiguity often between the relationship of what do you believe, do you allow within this institution, what is actually even possible, but not to shy away from these difficult questions. So therefore it's political with a small p, but it's deeply embedded, like, because we all, our bodies are politicized, right?
And then again, it allows, you know, again, this, I feel like we're discovering these things and moving through these things as well, as opposed to just being led, right, by an ideology as well. So I think all of these things, again, it's why these films resonate so much, I think.
Just asking questions, right?
Exactly,
And I think that one of his points that he makes repeatedly is that he doesn't research institutions before he goes into them. Making the film is the research. He goes in with curiosity and intelligence, and he assumes that the audience will do that too. Like he gives us the space to do that too.
But he does come from an environment where he understands institutional setups, right? So it's not like just completely from the outside.
But the other thing I find which is interesting, even watching this again, is that historically I think this film kind of tells that, you know, it's positioned as a kind of negative school, right? Which is kind of taking a kind of humanity and turning it into kind of the bodies, right? So the end bit when they're talking about I'm a body, you know, I'm in Vietnam. And it's funny to me that, you know, I think when you watch this film, a lot of the problematic instances come to mind, right? But when you hear about him showing it to the school, they're like, this is brilliant, this is what we do, you know? And so it's fascinating to see that, like, these two, you know, responses are present as well, right? Obviously, with any kind of media or art, you project yourself onto what's happening. But the fact that, you know, he can show this to the school board and stuff, and they're like, great, this is a perfect reflection of the work we're trying to do here, right? Whereas to the average person, you wouldn't necessarily be so celebratory of this portrayal of this particular institution.
I think that's right. I think the school only started to feel some disquiet when they realised that there were some reviews of the film that were not thinking that they were doing an amazingly good job. Before we open it up, I wanted to just talk a little bit about this idea of the films being, I guess, poetic. I mean, they're observational, but Fred often refers to them as reality fictions, and he talks about how when he's thinking about editing, he's more influenced by Emily Dickinson and Flaubert than he is by any cinema. On that sort of idea of the poetic nature, Andrea, I wondered if you felt there were any kind of resonances in your own work.
I think reality fictions was my foundation.
Yeah.
It's like you real life teaches you something, or the life you're working within and the people you're working with. And this is why I'm drawn to a kind of hybrid documentary, I guess. But then in the editing process, you give a a feeling. It's like making music, a composition or something. And again, like I feel I've always found it problematic when people say this is the factual understanding of it, because truth is all sorts of different interpretations. Also, who is reading what we are seeing, who's allowed to watch and who's allowed to be in it. So I think the poetry also of, and the cinematography, yeah, of course there's an ethics of it, but there's also closeness, there's a seeking of people behind other people, or sticking out the individuals within the system. So it's not just like how we are all like this, there also we are you and you and you and you, we all count, right? So it's like deeply poetic in that way, and touching.
I find it interesting that also, I mean, I think Fred has only worked with 4 cinematographers during his career, and 2 of them were, one on Titicut Follies and one on High School, and then the other 2 have worked across a large number of his films. But also that he is the sound recordist, so he's listening acutely and he's not looking through the viewfinder, so he's better able, I think, to kind of keep a sense of kind of where they might move the camera or what they could be doing. I mean, very definite sort of positioning of himself in that way.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that he, again, talks of his films as like movies as well, right?
Yeah.
And sees them as, you know, like exciting, full of incident movies, right? And uses it, and obviously he's a documentarian, but I think it's interesting that he's, you know, engaging with these things as films, right? And it's pretty fascinating because when you're talking about editing, one of the things I think is really beautiful about his films that you maybe feel a bit more in the longer films is just like the resonances of repetition. I think it's City Hall where it's focusing on this kind of like governor type figure. And the first time you see him, you're like, oh, he's a lovely guy, he's funny, he's charismatic. You see him doing the same things again and again and again and again, and you're like, oh, this is a performance, right? But then by the 5th time, you're like, this is his job, this is his work, right? Pretending that he's as interested, you know, saying the same things for the 10th time as he was the first time. And so all of these different kinds of things that come up again and resonate over time is a really beautiful and, again, poetic way of rendering the space. And each instance shifts your perspective, your perception of what you've just seen as well. So it's a really interesting, you know, poetic exploration of these kind of these things. And it's very musical, as you mentioned.
I think some people watched the film and did feel actually that the students were being sort of channeled, and that actually their autonomy was being reduced, and that they were being very definitely kind of set on certain courses. I think that was the kind of, those were the critical responses. They were certainly not to do with the filmmaking itself, but they were to do with the way in which, I guess, to sum it up, one generation was kind of imposing their values on the following generation.
Isn't that almost inevitable in the education system? I mean, I did think that sequence where the girls are doing a fashion parade and she keeps saying, you've got a leg problem, you're overweight. But then she sort of said at the end, you know, I just look like a fat woman. She did kind of include herself in that. I mean, that was uncomfortable. Isn't it
It's also
inevitable?
honest. Like I mean, I really hear what you say, because I feel sometimes, you know, instead of having a conversation around what kind of education do we want and how are we internalizing these kind of patriarchal ideas or like nuclear family ideas and Christian ideas, whatever. It's also like, I think sometimes people who have a very different school experience because they may be able to afford private school or have like a very different kind of life experience, will have different opinions than people come from state school, right? So, but we should have it would be good to have a conversation around how do we make it better instead of...
Yeah. And I think the students are great, you know. I think the students, you know, as you say, like, there's a rule and they push up against it. And there's many examples of them pushing up against these rules. I guess some of the things which are these kind of contradictory things, like the teacher saying, like, be a man, accept this attention, you know, and these kind of like, you know, and then the kind of sex education, and I think the structure of the school, these bits feel like, you know, and I understand it's the past, but these bits are the bits that...
These days in some schools, there's no more sex education in the United States. I mean, this is quite progressive, actually.
Sure, yeah. I mean, when you put it like that, yeah. But I think you're right, the children are great. Right? The kids are really interesting and really kind of like, you know, full of, you know, a certain kind of pushback, really.
Yeah. I think we have to, I'm so sorry, having invited your contributions. Now, of course, we have run over our allotted 30 minutes. But I dare say that we will be kind of making our way outside into the bar. Again, very happy to hear any thoughts or reflections that anyone would have on the conversation, on the films, on the season more generally. Let's just kind of really try and be in that spirit of having a conversation and keeping the conversation going. But for now, thank you all very much for being here and for contributing. And please join me particularly in thanking Andrea and Matthew.
Thank you.